So I have a really fun panel for you because every single one of these people is what I would say an in and out person. So they've been on both sides of the corporate startup divide and so can talk a little bit about that. So we have Layla White, who did a long stint in a whole bunch of banks, right? So most recently HSBC, before that was at Deutsche Bank. You've got quite a CV in the big banking world, but then recently started your own startup, which is all about helping startups actually go through some of that procurement and qualification process for working with a big bank. So, because it was obviously a big market need. So we'll get some insights from you on that. And then Stephen Rapoport, serial founder of many things, most famously probably is Packed Coffee. So, but you had also a stint inside Unilever for your sins.
I did.
So you've kind of seen the inside workings of how that is. I think you were sort of vice, president of Disruptive Ventures, right? Which is like...
Yes, I was vice president of Disruptive Innovation.
Innovation,
all new business models and so on.
Yeah.
No, there wasn't a president.
Oh, right, okay. So you were kind of the disruptive innovation models rolled into one. But it's one of those cases, and we can get into that, fancy title probably was a lot less disruptive than you sort of thought it might be in the beginning. And then Jonathan Carrier, who, again, a long history in the automotive industry, so, a Jaguar Land Rover, but then you became quite frustrated with Jaguar Land Rover and created InMotion Ventures, which is their VC arm, so that he could do kind of creative things. And then even that wasn't enough for you because you've now gone on to not only work in a whole bunch of startups, but now you've founded your own startup, which is ZipCharge, which is, you can tell us about that, but it's basically a kind of mobile charging station for your car, which is pretty cool. So corporate startup relationships. I'm going to do a bit of audience participation. Don't worry, I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, but just raise your hand if you have a partnership, a deal, maybe some funding from a big corporate at this point, right? Okay, keep your hands up. And then keep it up if you're really happy with how that's going. Like, you have no, Okay, so people are fairly satisfied. There's a few hands moving up and down. So, so I think suffice it to say, these can be really tricky relationships. And there was a survey by McKinsey last year, which we wrote about in Sifted, which was something like only 27% of all startups that work with a corporate are kind of happy with how that relationship goes. So less than a third of them are. I was surprised it was even as high as 27% being kind of happy. So there's a lot of kind of teething problems both on both sides. And we were going to kind of try in this session to sort of talk a little bit about some of those, but also like how you can work through them. Because I think, if you're a B2B business, you want a big customer. It's not like you can kind of pretend that you can't go through the corporate relationship. So let's start with some of the horror stories. Layla, I'm gonna start with you because you see a lot of the kind of pressure that a big company can kind of put on a startup that it's trying to have a helpful relationship with, but will still do things that can completely steamroller things.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, I worked in banks before, and I'd been the person negotiating against the suppliers. And now being on the other side of the fence, I really feel for them. I feel quite bad, actually, sometimes. But we've had scenarios where it's quite typical where a large corporate will say, I like the product. Can we have a trial? Yeah, we'll give you access to our demo platform. You can go and play around with it. Oh, can we have a 3-month free trial? And we had it recently, and it just cut me so bad. Trying to talk to large corporates, especially ones who are invested in things like the FinTech pledge and understanding or wanting to understand the pressures that startups face. And then when you have a request like that, I was quite taken aback. And I think I'm quite a forward, confident person. But I sort of sat on it for a week, talked to my team about it, and went back and politely said, that's £60,000 to us. We have to go through onboarding. We have to get a lawyer involved. I have to size the team. I have to bring people on because we don't just offer a SaaS product. It's a service behind it. And then I don't really want to bring people on for a 3-month period and training month and then let them go because morally that's not right. And also something that I felt compelled to talk to them about was, there are startups out there who are desperate to get that traction. The people who were before talking about that, getting that product market fit. And if that's taken you 18 months and you've put so much time, effort, energy, costs, you've got an investor on your back, and if you get that opportunity and you're asked to give that trial for 3 months, I mean, it can be really debilitating for some people. And if you haven't got the money, and as I said clearly to these guys, some people will be so desperate they'll remortgage their house. And that's the situation I think that founders sometimes find themselves in, where perhaps large corporates don't consider these impacts. They want to work with sexy technology providers who are innovative and flexible, but it comes with a price, and I think that's sort of like that's certainly one of the stories that I hear repeatedly.
And are you finding that you can push back a little bit on that, or is it still hard?
It's hard. I mean, I'm starting to, I think, because now I've got traction, I've got the ear of some big people and some big banks, but I can now show my vulnerability a little bit. But certainly in the early days, I probably would have said, okay, I need to find a way around to do it, and try and find some money. But I'm certainly making it part of my agenda with our company to be the voice of the supplier back to the banks. And I think it's not that large corporates are doing it on purpose. They're not trying to be malicious towards you. It's just, I think, a complete lack of understanding about what it's, I mean, we were talking about it earlier, what it's like to be a founder and those particular pressures.
Yeah. So Stephen, you're nodding a lot. So tell us what's kind of some of the worst cases you've seen. I think it's fair to say a massive fan of the way big corporates handle these.
No, I mean, no, I'm not. And I think if that's not clear to everyone yet, it will be shortly. No, I just want to echo exactly what you've said. There's no malice at all when these partnerships go wrong. But in 2 years at Unilever, I certainly didn't see one go right. None at all? In that I didn't see any that clearly, demonstrably created value for the founders or for the startup. And I'm sort of the opinion that when you're running a startup, like your time is so valuable that investing any time or any money in something that's not valuable does destroy value. So I think you could go a step further and say they were value destructive for the startups. And I think the thing that sort of irked me, I suppose, the most when I was there was the sheer, and it's not, when I say ignorance, I don't mean that in a critical way or a judgmental way. I just mean genuinely, there's a lack of empathy between sort of corporate innovators or corporate leaders and the startups that they seek to, in part, emulate and that they want to work with. And I think quite often you would hear quite advanced conversations happening between the business and the startup. And I'd always sort of, through first principle thinking, try to encourage my colleagues to explain really clearly what value they thought there was for Unilever in that partnership. And I'd say 90% of the time you would get to the point where, well, we're kind of trying to undergo agile transformation across this 200,000 person business, and we're all fucking confused. And maybe by observing them for a bit, we'll understand it a bit more. So, okay, I mean, that doesn't sound like a great plan, but have you shared that information with the startup? And what I found was that, in a corporation, again, really well-meaning people just move at a different pace with a different risk profile. The relationships between sort of what Unilever or what any corporation really can get out of most startup partnerships is really immaterial relative to the value the startup can get, which can be completely transformative. Yeah. And so I just think that imbalance leads to a lot of problems down the line. Yeah,
there's much less at stake. I mean, I guess that's the thing. And do you think that's the reason why so many startups get caught in what gets called innovation theatre, which is, it's cool to get these startups in. There's this vague goal, like this whole thing of, oh, well, maybe we'll learn something from watching these people. I mean, that's not really a basis for a business deal, is it? Like a solid business deal is you have something I want, and then together we're going to make this thing, and we're all going to make a lot of money out of it. If that's not on the corporate's radar, then they're not investing really a lot of time, effort, or money ultimately in that partnership.
No, I think that's right. And the analogy that I would use is, the role at Unilever. That's the first time I've ever been employed by somebody else. It was my first experience of working in any company, and it was sort of from one extreme to another, I suppose, because it is a very big, very with 200,000 full-time employees, of course it's going to be political, because politics are how you govern that number of people. So again, not a judgment, just an observation. And I think the analogy I'd use is that most of the senior individuals within Unilever probably see themselves as the startup that needs to outcompete all of the other startups. And so actually the value created by a startup partnership in a corporation where people put a lot of value on innovation and forward thinking and future fit business models and pick another buzzword, actually the value you create is you probably make that individual look very good and you feed their career. Yep. And I think that's why there's so much excitement and so much sort of oxygen around startup partnerships in corporations.
Yeah.
And again, I think if there was more transparency from the outset, it would probably certainly save founders a lot of wasted time and effort.
So it feels like, because it feels like such a big prize, but what I hear both of you saying, and I'll sort of get your perspective in a minute, Jonathan, but like it's a big prize. It's like potentially riches, right? But then actually you have to be really, beware of this. Like it can also destroy your business as much as make it. So, but Jonathan, I mean, I think you were out of all three the most optimistic. I think. Did you see some good practice, and was there good practice?
I'm probably on the slightly more positive side of the cynicism that's here. It's entirely contextual on the industry, the startup, the corporate. At the end of the day, startups want to be end-ups. That's what corporates are. Whether they're 20-year-old, 30-year-old, 100-year-old end-up, ultimately that's where every startup end-up aspires to be. And they are two sides of the same coin. And the question is, how do you get the matching between the ambition, the mutual gain, the opportunity, the clock speed, which is often talked about, and to bring it into automotive parlance, which I'll always do, it's a bit like a gearbox. You've got one very fast-moving cog and another slower, bigger one, and, you need some form of synchro mesh that allows them to align up. Often that can go wrong, but finding that right mechanism that allows those two gears to mesh is actually really important. And if you do it right, it can lead to some levels of success, I believe. But honestly, you go into it eyes wide open and understand some of the signals upon which that corporate is giving you, on which the relationship can be founded. So to answer your question, specifics, I've seen it where running accelerator programs where it's kind of more a collaboration program where you've got multiple corporates, multiple startups working over a 6-month period to do proof of concepts. And there you actually have an understanding of how do we explore product market fit or a specific new use case that is actually very targeted over a defined period of time with an actual outcome of this is what we're going to learn and how we will share that back. And ultimately, I would argue you don't want to be aiming for the big prize because that should be an output down the line of the work that you do and the relationship that you would otherwise build rather than the goal of the exercise of collaborating with the corporate.
And is it... you were talking about sort of it makes sense at certain times when in your startup journey. So is it fair to say there are kind of moments when it makes sense, like maybe in the really early stages when you want to just explore, before you really have a working product and you need somebody to help you make it, then it can make sense to work. And then again, when you're sort of a bit further down the line and you have something that you could genuinely sell, but maybe the middle bit is the bit where you can get caught up.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's actually too early can actually be too frustrating and lead to a huge amount of cynicism because corporates will want to show some form of validation. You've kind of got to put yourself inside the corporate innovator's shoes and understand both the internal politics, if you can, which is rightly articulated, but also what their innovation accounting is all about, because that's important, because the language that they will use inside the corporate, very, very different to how you will otherwise run your business and how you look at what innovation means. And therefore the outcomes of success need to be translated. You need Babelfish for corporate innovation, to be able to understand those mutual outcomes, but also translate it in a way that makes sense on both sides.
Are there some warning signs, do you think, of when it's going wrong? Layla, you look like you were sort of...
First of all, I am pro working with corporates. I know that there are, I've seen horror stories, and I know that obviously you've had a very different experience, but we actively promote startups working with large corporates. But what we're seeing, what we want to do is improve that relationship and to try and help educate startups so they understand, like you were saying, about different languages and how the two move at very different paces. I think one of the troubling piece of feedback startups get is when they've got given the not a direct yes, not a direct no, let's talk again in 6 months, which is hard to take when you're in startup mode. Like, I haven't got 6 months, And I think that it's easy to get hung up on that. I think, but I think that certainly what we've learned is to sort of take it in, accept it and move on. But other kind of warning themes that I've seen and definitely have learned from is that if you go into you're early on in your stage of having your company and you're talking to your clients because you're trying to work out what that market fit's going to be. So certainly for us, we started to market it. We want to fix this. What do you think? It's easy to be swayed by the big corporates who will say, oh, this is a really good idea. Wouldn't it be great if you did that? And in the early stages, we pivoted because we wanted that sale. But they are being well-meaning, they're trying to help you, but there's no commitment from them. There's no contract commitment. They're trying to help you, but actually that's a great idea. I'll go and build it. That's cost me X amount of money and X amount of time, and then you've lost all of that. I think they're the things that I would say right from the start to watch out for. Be really careful. Don't get sucked into that because it's wasting your time, your money, your energy, and actually probably your kind of excitement for the company potentially.
Yeah.
You've got to be careful not to fall into the trap of becoming the outsourced R&D innovation arm
Absolutely.
of the corporate, which is very easy to fall into in the view of chasing that prize that you'll do whatever and actually then miss the bigger picture. So I think that's a key
especially if
watch
there's no guarantee that they're actually going to buy it. If it's a sort of, go and develop this and then we'll talk. I mean, you really have lost out. Have you seen other things, Stephen? What again, is there kind of any warning bell that goes off when you can hear the way that somebody in a meeting is talking about it and you can kind of think, no, that's probably not going to go anywhere?
I think there's a couple front of mind. So one is if the corporate's not able to articulate in really clear terms their objectives, rational economic outcomes, their objectives for the partnership, or if they can, but those objectives change between one conversation and the next, then I would simply close the door. I'd also want to diligence that the person that you're speaking with, even if they can speak in, actually I love the idea of a translator. If they can speak in terms that we speak in and that you understand, I think that's a good sign. And I'd want to diligence that they're not a kind of lone wolf, and actually they do have a remit from the wider business. And finally, if they've got an objective for a startup partnership, I would want to know who else they're speaking to, because if it's only you, they're not very serious about delivering that partnership. So a smart partnership you would expect would start with objectives, have a think about who we could partner with to do that, because otherwise you may have come together through serendipity and they're excited. It's the excitement. And, no one likes to pour cold water on hope.
Yeah.
But I do think excitement drives a lot of the activity within corporates and not a great number of outcomes. Yeah. I'm minded of one conversation I had while I was there with a fantastic, actually a corporate innovator, a guy called Shilan, who's unbelievable, superb. And I reached out to him because I thought there were some things that we could do together. And he replied to my email. I was so taken aback because he replied to my email pretty bluntly, and he said, look, with respect, although I'd love to work with you guys, these are the 45 Unilever colleagues that I've spoken to in the last 2 years. So if you have any conversations, you need to speak to all of them before you waste any more of my time, because they know everything that there is to know about my business. And I was like, wow, 45. And I looked down the list and I knew half of them. And you just think the number of hours, days, weeks, months that he's invested in fruitless exploratory conversations.
So and I think these 45 conversations and none of them had gone.
Well, I'm sure they were all still in flight. Another, as in, not dead yet. They're not good at killing things in corporates. But the other conversation, I met with an ice cream brand that I really, really liked. I worked in the ice cream company for a bit, which was lovely. And I met this ice cream company that were doing amazing things with new formulations, and it was a bit healthier, and it was full of protein and plant-based. You can probably guess the various tick boxes. And they were bottlenecked. They were growing really, really fast. The thing that was slowing them down was that they couldn't get access to high-quality manufacture or distribution. So I spoke to our R&D team and said, look, do you think we could give them access to ours? Because ours is the best in the world. That would probably double, if not more, significantly sort of increase their rate of growth. And I've spoken to the founders, and they would give us a call option over the whole company if we gave them access to that. In a year's time, we can accelerate their growth to the point where we want to buy them, and then buy them without competitive tension, and they're up for it. And I was so pleased with this. This sounded like such a great win-win. And it was 11 months of conversations internally. There wasn't a single person in the business who didn't think it was a good idea, but we hadn't yet reached absolute total consensus decision. And 11 months in, I apologized to the founders. I said, look, here's all of the materials. Go to one of our competitors. They're not serious. Like, they're pissing you about and wasting your time, and I'm so, so sorry. And
so was that really so 11 months, I mean, was it just indecisiveness, or was it that they really, despite telling you to your face that they thought it was a good idea, that people really didn't think it was, and they were kind of stringing it along?
I think in the end, the team that were assessing that, and bear in mind, it was a small opportunity for the business. They do 20 billion of revenue a year, and this was a 15 million turnover company. And by the end, the team that were appointed to discuss that, I think the steering committee was probably 12 people from 3 different markets. And everyone had to align on the detailed operating manual for R&D and who was going to, what am I trying to say? It was waterfall. It was totally waterfall.
I think this is the problem as well, and certainly I think the benefit that I have coming from working in big banks into a small startup and talking to so many startups is the real disconnect. And you know, even though I've worked in that world, I still feel frustrated that things take so long to get a response back or to get any kind of traction. But the reality is, when you're working with a large corporate, their priorities very different to what your priorities are. That, you know, that your big problem is small compared to everything else they're looking at, and they have to. Everything's been done by a committee, and that's the reality of it. There's so much red tape, so much bureaucracy. I think we might get onto it a bit later, but when it comes into like the procurement piece. If you've worked in a startup, everyone avoids procurement. Everyone leaves procurement until right to the end because it's always seen as the blocker. That's going to be the thing that puts the fire out, and I don't want to go near them. I worked in procurement. It's my fault. And I can honestly say, looking back at it, and it's one of the reasons why I started the company, is that I was just so busy. I was flat out working with so many different departments, and so my priorities are very different to now how they are, obviously. But you know, if you look at those central teams like legal, procurement, compliance, they're often the central hubs, and they're often the busiest teams across the whole company. So when you've found someone in the business who's getting excited, hopefully for good reasons, about your product, they might have 3, 4, 5 projects to run. Procurement and legal and compliance have hundreds. So you are one small person, one small tiny piece, and so that delay is so challenging for the startup. It's unbelievable, but it's not through trying to be difficult. They're just so busy, and I think that's where there's a real disconnect. And I certainly feel like, from a startup's perspective, what I really want is honest answers, like an honest yes, no. Like, don't worry about hurting my feelings, because if it's a no, it's fine, I'll move on. But I think that's where corporates are really kind of considerate. They don't want to upset anybody, they're worried about their reputation. But I think that, I'm certainly seeing it from some banks. Bank of America have talked about how they try and give a quick yes or a quick no so that the startup can move on. And I think that's where, I think that's a good starting point, really.
Yeah.
But also startups understanding why it's taken so long. You know, there is a hell of a lot to get through, and lots of people to sign off on one piece.
Well, compliance, risk and legal, that's three people who, and at least one of them, their whole remit is like find and eradicate risk of any description. And so someone suggesting bringing a startup into the building probably gives them cold sweats.
Yeah.
In the end, legal, the solution that we came up with was they would give whoever was trying to do the partnership a piece of paper saying, I'm taking personal liability for this partnership because Unilever's not prepared to. So I'm prepared to sign this. That probably no one's going to die. I know that it wasn't made in our factory, all of this stuff.
Yeah.
But
Jonathan, do you find that, because I'm just thinking on the liability side, like when you're dealing with car manufacturers, I mean, it's also really serious. You can...
Yeah, very much so, because it depends on what you're doing and how you ring fence it. I guess with most corporates, it's quite easy to be able to tar them with the same brush. And most of them have been to the gym by now. They've been to the innovation gym. They've started lifting some weights. They're getting a bit more familiar. And I think many are now in a position where they're much more able to deal with the legal side and the purchasing side. It doesn't mean it's quick, certainly not startup world quick, but definitely in a case of how you can start to build a relationship and get going. The question I'd always say within this is, how do you set yourself up for success? Because those, as much as the signals for awareness and, you know, risk, it's also about what are the signals for success. Just like you'd do with any, you know, VC when you're raising money, or, you know, you'd run your own due diligence. You'd look at the corporate and you'd say, what's the track record of engaging with startups? How do they set themselves up for corporate innovation? And what do the outcomes actually look like? You can see that as a helicopter view, and there's no harm in asking them, tell us, what do you want to be able to achieve, and why are you engaged with startups for those very reasons? But I think when it comes to the nitty-gritty of your technology and how you deploy it, absolutely think about deploying a framework agreement. And within that framework agreement, it's essential to share the mutual outcomes, what the goals are, you know, the specific, show me a tangible benefit of that activity and what that's going to deliver, but also to make it time-bound because of the reasons that we've talked about. And the time frame will be entirely dependent on the type of collaboration, the partnership, the test, the trial, whatever it might be. You know, and I think that's so very important.
So definitely put a time limit on, you know, this is how long it's going to take, and then at the end of that, you'd have a yes or a no, you know, like just try to keep things very definite, because I think that what we're hearing across the board is you can just, it's the endless sort of stringing you along. Yeah. I wanted to ask you something, Jonathan, and jump in at the others as well, but like protecting your IP when you go into something like this. I mean, you've got a fairly technical product that you're now taking around. Do you worry that, you know, if you show too much of it to somebody and they then just kind of end up taking your best ideas and you don't get a deal with them?
Not particularly, because it's how it's ultimately how the IP is already protected, you know, and some of the other activities behind it. I think within the framework agreement, pretty much any activity you have with a corporate, you're going to sign an NDA to some degree. Hopefully it's two-way and it's protecting yourself and protecting your IP. If you're deploying a trial, and this is the thing that we're clearly very focused on, is it depends on what each party is bringing to the table, and therefore understanding the difference between foreground and background IP, and then what is ultimately then shared if there's a mutual collaboration, and what the outcome and what the rights are to be able to use that any IP that results from it is pretty important. But, you know, the corporates should be relatively relaxed about that, because most of the time the startups are bringing their IP as opposed to any of the background IP that comes from the corporate.
Yeah, I think I think it depends. Like, it's certainly for trials, I would agree. Like, it's about the foreground and background IP and being really clear about it. And I think certainly having been in the procurement space, I would urge anyone to be really clear about what they want to come out of that trial, and making sure they're really clear, even from in any respect, that they maintain their IP, they own it. We found, like, our IP, I mean, it's like there's no process, there's no IP in a process. Like that's what we're fixing, but there's no IP in it. And our product it's good, but it's not like a massively amazingly technical product like blockchain or anything. It's a process fixer. But our IP is in our suppliers, in our contacts, and that's 2 years worth of hard graft getting suppliers on board. So we found in the early stages that we wanted banks to sign up, so we were giving them free access to our IP. But I think you get to that tipping point where you can start to sort of dictate what you are going to show and what you're not going to show, whereas now we won't give free access to all of that. But there is a chart, like there is a risk really that if you don't go forward, if you don't move forward and you don't trust in the NDA, for example, the mutual NDA, you can be stagnated. So it's about trying to find that balance really.
Yeah. Stephen, did you see any bad practice of somebody just kind of hoovering ideas? So that
no, none at all. And like I said, I mean, I never saw a single bit of malice. Actually, for all of, I know I'm probably allowing some of my personal frustration to come through. It was a hugely high integrity organisation, great behaviour, or rather great intention. On the IP side, I'd say and obviously this varies so much by industry and by partnership. But you know what you do, maybe you're a deep tech company working with another technology company, and the risk might be greater. Because fundamentally, I was in food and beverage. It's not like a bleeding edge technology industry. But if you look at like the universe of options that corporations have to crack disruptive innovation, they can build something themselves, they can acquire something, they can partner with someone, or they can invest as a minority investor through CVC. And I have the least concern that they would steal IP, because the reason typically that corporates struggle to build their own disruptive innovation is because they run on a 12-month P&L, and we all know that the return on innovation is a lot longer than that if you're doing something disruptive. So my view is if they saw value in your IP, that would be a reason to have the conversation and get excited, because they're much more likely to acquire you than to try to mimic. Okay. Or try to rip you off.
I think I don't know. I think it depends. Like, certainly in the banking world, I think everyone talks. All the suppliers talk to each other, and I'm not saying this to be really negative, but there are some banks that have a reputation for trials, never getting back to them, taking that idea and going building themselves. We facilitate trials, like that's what we're about, like enabling relationships, and you can put a trial in place really quickly. I'm not going to say any of the names in here, but I think
it's a shame.
It's a shame.
Contact Layla on the
they're not on our marketplace yet, so don't worry. Trying to steer clear. I would personally go into it and work out, have they got a huge tech team that does loads of developing, and are they running trials? Because if they've got a massive dev team, I probably wouldn't go for a trial with them, because they might be inclined to go, oh, we can go and build that really quickly. I would look at the structure and see how they're doing. Are they more buyer? Are they more partnership? Or are they a typical like tech company? That's my perspective anyway.
Okay, so yeah, so I guess in the same way that we said you should do due diligence on your investors, you really need to do due diligence on that corporate and to gauge, could they steal your idea? I mean, we were having a conversation before this that a lot of companies, a lot of big corporates couldn't do that, because any idea that does come up, then, it has to go through a sort of 12-month investment committee type hearing thing, which will kill it stone dead anyway. So perhaps some are less capable of doing that anyway. I want to make sure we leave some time for questions. So if you have questions, start thinking about them now. I'm going to kind of lob a final one at you guys, which is, what are things, where do you think the lines are in terms of what you can push back on, and what do you just have to suck up? Because, Layla, you were saying you're now at the stage where you can say, look, I'm not going to give you access to the full database. Other people might be able to say, look, you don't get a free trial. You have to, or I've heard other startups also say that they got to a phase where they just wouldn't do pilots anymore, because they said, look, we don't need to test it. We have a fully working product. Either just buy it, don't buy it, but we're not going to faff around with piloting. So what are for you, I'll start with you, Jonathan, but what do you think, what can a startup legitimately sort of push back on? And then are there some absolutes, like legal liability, you're just going to have to do what the corporate wants?
Well, yeah, it's dependent on the sector and if there's regulatory requirements, which clearly in banking there is as well. So that's clearly non-negotiable. Clearly any access to IP, any engagement around data, GDPR and compliance, anything else like that is non-negotiable. But I think generally an openness is permitted because it can actually help to support the relationship. But that has to be both ways, respect, but never treat the corporate with deference. And I think that's also pretty important, because if you do, well, actually, it's about bargaining power, and you've got the innovation, you've got the technology, and ultimately they require that more than you would ultimately need them as a customer, because there's plenty of customers in the sea.
Mm.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think it's the same as negotiating a term sheet. I think you can push back on absolutely everything, and you should push back on anything you're uncomfortable with, but then frame your expectation with the answers that come back. Might seem a bit unusual, time frames, number of people that might need to say yes, and so on. But I think if you're speaking to a corporate and there's a potential partnership on the table that might change the future of your business, you're going to be looking at that and really worrying and saying, I can't do or say anything that will knock this out of bed. And the reality is no one within the corporation is going to be thinking or feeling that way. So you can push back in a really open and candid and transparent and respectful way, and they'll might say yes and they might say no, but they won't take offence, and I don't think negotiation ever ended a good deal.
I don't think it'd ever make a tangible difference to the outcome
No,
that we would otherwise
right.
perhaps have realised anyway.
Yeah.
And Layla, didn't you find this when you were doing on the procurement side in big banks, that actually a lot of the procurement terms could be negotiated?
Oh, absolutely. Everything's up for negotiation. I think when I talk about pushing back, that's really at the early stages when I'm trying to get them to want to try the product out. But if you know you're going to have a deal, you know you've got someone in the business who's hooked in, who's committed, who's invested in it, everything's negotiable. It will take longer. I think that's what you need to consider. Like, what's your run rate like? Do you need to get the contract across the line quickly? In which case, you're going to say, well, I'm going to probably challenge on limitations like your liability, your insurance piece, and I'm not going to pay 10 million insurance. I'm going to pay 2. That's one area that you absolutely should push back on because it costs a lot of money. And actually, for a note here, if you're being pushed to pay a lot more, then actually go back to the business and say, I will do that insurance. I don't think it's right, but then you're going to have to cover the cost of the delta, and I would do that. But I think it's just working out, like, if you need to get that contract across the line, then you're going to absorb a lot more. When we got our first contract across the line with our first bank, there was a lot more that I said okay to, but I know that in the next one, I'm going to be a bit more, going to push back. Also, I think what's really helpful, I always found really helpful when I worked in banks, and I do it now, is when you've got that hook, just send an email about what are the key outcomes that you need, what are the key things that you need out of that contract, because it keeps it focused as well. And then everything else, you say, well, I might give on that. So it might be, for us, it's IP remains with us, we don't pay crazy insurance, and we need publicity. We need publicity rights. So work out what those key ones are, share that really early on, and make sure you're keeping focused on that.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. If you what you want is to have a big customer that you can shout about, but then they want you to be this super secret supplier that you never get to speak about that. I mean, is that deal worth doing? Right?
I mean, they won't, like, it's not common for banks to allow that. So just be mindful of it. But then if it's really important to your company and really important to your growth, think about, before you go into that conversation, what you're willing to give on. So are you going to give them a big discount? Like, how big is that deal? Is it about the cash, or is it about the name? Because for us, it's about the name. Yeah. So, really consider those things.
In the framework agreements I put in place with potential customers at the moment is always a clause about the publication or the publicity, that both parties reserve the right, but also they have to mutually agree to deliver it. So at least it provisions for it and sets that out, that it's a potential.
Okay. Now, listen, I want to open it out to the room. Does anyone have questions? Because we've got people whose brains we can pick. Right, we have one at the front. Just wait for the microphone to come over to you.
Hi, thanks for this excellent presentation. I had lots of horror stories from this, and I could add up from my experience trying to pilot with corporates that didn't work out well. But there must be the good side, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I know of startups that piloted with corporates, and it will help them take off. So if there is a takeaway message for us today, what would that be, in the sense of what's the best predictor that this collaboration, this partnership will work well or not? Because scattered, I heard lots of good things, like if this company has worked with startups before, how badly they want the solution, how big the problem is for them, why now and not before, what has changed, what's happening in the background. If we could think of both success stories and
it's an excellent question. Like, what's a good sign that something will work?
I think the way that we work, and we're a great success story when it comes to working with corporates. I owe so much to a large corporate who's now on our advisory board, and we're doing really well with these large corporates. Something that I think is a really good indicator, and what we try and achieve, and I think is a good option for you guys, is that try and go to the highest possible person. Because if you can get a relationship with someone who's really senior, and you can strike up a rapport with them and a mutual understanding and a mutual common ground, and if they're invested and willing to give their time and effort to having conversations with you and giving you feedback, that for me, certainly in our company, is a really good indicator that it's going to go well. But you need that. Ultimately, you want to develop a stakeholder map as early on as possible and work out who's the highest person you can get to. And if they're invested in you, I think that's a really good indication that you're going to do well.
Stephen, any thoughts on what's...
I'm the wrong person to ask.
Okay,
honestly.
well, you had you didn't
I've not
see any
actually
good...
seen a successful partnership between a corporation and a startup in the wild.
Okay. Jonathan, I think you're more optimistic. So what were signs of the ones that worked well?
Mutual outcomes is pretty much how you define it, and having that perspective from each side of how are you going to contribute and what that contribution looks like, and ultimately then what the outcome is. And I think there's no better foundation upon which you can build any relationship in life generally without that kind of shared common outcomes essential for the success.
Okay, so we have like we have another question over at the back there in the sort of light coloured shirt.
Related to your answer, actually, in terms of just get to the highest person you can, what I found is that when you're speaking to companies you want to, might be corporates or not, that you want to get into a partnership with, usually you're speaking with the business development person, but if you need any kind of development, they need to speak with a product team. And like loads of other people that actually you're not in the room with in the first instance. So that's where really the process gets stopped. Is like then they go internally and they do their job of speaking with everybody, and then at some point somehow, I don't know, in a year's time or something like that, they might come back to you with what their team thought and what their roadmap looks like, and if they can squeeze you in or something. So how do you actually go over that? Because I feel like the team structure right now is not, so this thing of business development and then product team is actually not in line with where we are, in kind of as tech companies, because the disconnect between those two teams actually makes the whole, maybe the partnership or eventual partnership fall apart.
Yeah, are there any good tips for how do you get to the actual right person rather than,
It's about finding it's a sponsor. Really, it's not just about someone who likes you. It's finding the sponsor in the business who's going to sell for you, and that's the thing. Because banks and large corporates are so silo orientated, they almost act like their own companies, and there is competition between each. There's always a bit of land grabbing going on and roles and responsibilities. But what you ideally, I should have been clearer, when you're looking for someone as senior as possible, you're looking for someone who's going to sponsor you and help to sell your product and promote your product and your company through the bank, and that's really, really key. It's not easy to achieve. Like if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. Do
you find that you start the conversation internally and then you try to find the senior person, or do you find the senior person try and find that entry point? Some people you don't want to put any noses out of joint. I use LinkedIn a lot. Like I think that. And you'll approach the senior person first.
Yeah, I mean, like with our first bank, I was really lucky. I think I'd worked at Deutsche Bank. I'd obviously done an okay job because the guy who was there, head of IT, went on to another bank and was on the board of directors. And I said, I've got this idea. I had lunch with him. I'm thinking about doing it. Oh, that's really great. And so then he connected me to the person who's the global head of innovation. I think that right at the start, my investor said, you need to use your network, you need to use your CV, and it's so important. Don't be afraid to think you have to go in at the bottom, because sometimes those at the bottom have got really great ideas, really well-meaning, but they haven't got any clout. They can't make those decisions. So you want to try and work your network as much as possible, go in as high as you can. And if you've got a product, if they see a value in yours, then you want their sponsorship. If they don't, then perhaps your market fit isn't quite right. Yeah. But you want them to sell for you within the business.
I've also seen examples where some companies are sort of letting their business divisions that really need that product to do the kind of, liaison, and that seems to work well. So it's not necessarily, a CEO or a CFO deciding, okay, this would be great, and let's make, the finance team use this. It's sort of people in finance saying, we have this big problem, actually. And it was interesting. So it was Airbus that changed the way that they were going to work with startups. So they're basically doing there's no scouting team anymore. They let the divisions will scout who they want to work with, because their head of sort of venture building said, they kind of know who they want to work with already, so there's no point in trying to go and... So I don't know if that's an answer for you, but I think it could be about also trying to find somebody internally in a real business division that really, really needs that, because you ultimately, at the end of the day, you're going to need them as your sort of user, sponsor, advocate. So I don't know, maybe it's a bit of both.
A bit of both, yeah.
So up and down. Well, we're kind of coming to the end of the time. We've got time for, another question. If anybody, yes, we have a hand there on this side in the dark jacket.
Great, thank you. Hi, really interesting session. I work in health tech and have certainly had both good and bad relationships with corporates overall, and I had a corporate who stole an idea and then became a competitor. So
it does happen.
Yeah, sadly. But I also had good. I mean, I guess it's a very David and Goliath thing. So I don't know if you've got any advice for when you're very small, you don't have the people to ask, the kind of advisors around you, or even we made a lot of mistakes because we didn't have investors who actually you can ask for help. So when you are small, any advice, kind of because you're dealing with trying to negotiate on IP or partnership arrangements, and actually these are difficult things. So I don't know. Yeah, any kind of final words of advice on what to do when you're very small and.
Well, obviously you get Layla to do your procurement.
We can't talk to her.
Buy Layla a coffee.
I found that in the early stage, and we had an angel investor who's amazing, but hands off, let's just get on with it, and gave us some money. But it wasn't not a huge amount of money. I found, if I'm honest with you, the best support were through networking events, to be honest, like things like Women of FinTech. Gemma Young runs that. Also our marketing manager, amazing woman. But like those events where we were talking about it earlier, about having that outreach to talk to other founders, to understand the troubles that you're going through are the same as what other people go through. And I think quite often it's about working with other people and having a coffee or a catch-up, because that's how you learn. And I think community within the startup world is really, really important. And I think that's why you've set this up. And I think lean on that as much as possible.
But what about, do you need to have like a lawyer,
Yes.
early on? Obviously you
Yes.
do. But like, but honestly, like, because the corporate will have like 15 legal, a strong legal team, and you might have a part-time lawyer who does a bit of stuff for you. How problematic is that?
So the first thing is, when you get a contract, quite often, I think the big disconnect with banks and startups is that they give you a contract that is probably fit for Microsoft or Oracle, and it's not fit for a startup. And they haven't really taken the time to think, oh, this won't work, and they'll just dish it out to you. And so you're given something, you go, oh my God, push back on it. But obviously, your costs will skyrocket if you're not careful with legal. I think maybe we've certainly got contacts in the sector where we know that ex kind of like legally people, procurement people, try and get someone to have a quick read over your contracts, for a favour. But you do need to get lawyers involved. And I think you need to bake that into your business plan. You need to have a lot of money set aside for legal. There's no... I would say for us, every engagement we put like £40,000 aside, and it's a lot of money, but you're not going to get bitten. And if you get money left over, great, that's the kitty for the drinks, but just be prepared for it.
Okay, I think we could go on, but I'm being told we need to wrap up. So, any more questions? I think we've next got some, is it networking drinks or the coffee break? So there'll be some time to chat through more of these. There's a short break coming up, and then we have 2 more sessions to round off the day. So, I won't stop you. I won't keep you from coffee. But thank you very much, and thank you, Layla, Stephen, and Jonathan, for sharing those insights.